Welcome everyone to the second day of CSEdX for 2024. This is day 2, obviously, and we're in stream 2.3, which is the roundtable discussions that we've got. We've got 2 roundtable discussions this morning, and it's fantastic to have everyone in this session. And I can see people just joining at the moment. Please be aware that this session is currently being recorded. Thank you, Lachlan. And I also request that everyone here make sure that they have their microphones turned off until we get to the discussion component. Because this is a roundtable session, there is no specific Q&A session at the end. So there's no additional Q&A session. We would just have discussions within each of the timeframes allocated to each of the roundtables. And before we move on to the actual presentations, I would like to do the acknowledgement of country, and I pay my respects to the First Nations elders past, present and emerging across all of the lands where CSU's campuses are located. And in particular, I acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Birrabia peoples, and I also pay my respects to any First Nations colleagues in this session today. I am currently on Wiradjuri land down at Thaguna in Albury, and it's a nice day, it's cool and it's raining down here. So with our 2 roundtables today, the first roundtable we have is Alan Gunn and a couple of other colleagues from the School of Agricultural, Environmental and Veterinary Sciences. And Alan and Michelle and Bruce are here to lead a discussion around how appropriate are videos and podcasts for workplace or work integrated learning assessment.
Thanks very much, Steph, and to Lachlan and Harriet and all the rest of the organisers. I'm going to try share. I need permission, please, Steph.
Yeah. I don't know if I can give you
permission.
I
think you've got it now. Yeah, let me go. Is this working?
Yep.
We're there, yeah?
Yeah.
All good.
I can't really see the Zoom Now session, so that's probably a good thing. Yes, this is important that it's not just me. This is a collaborative thing with my 2 fantastic colleagues, Professor Bruce Allworth in charge of the production animal team, and Michelle Eastwood, who was phase 3 coordinator at the time, but is now the course director. That we've all had our little discussions about the use of video assessment and how appropriate they are for work integrated learning assessment. And our job is to try and develop what Francisco Treda, who used to be at CSU, said, developing a deliberate professional. I kind of quite like that title. And the challenge of assessing professional competence during work integrated learning, and in this case, it's actually more specific as it's actually in the workplace. So how do we go about assessing that, especially when they're remote to us here in the academic institution out at the distributed practices? So somebody suggested to me that I was first involved with this when we did the preclinical animal husbandry extramural studies, and somebody suggested that we should do a video assessment, and I thought to them, what a stupid idea, and kind of went away and then thought, oh, maybe it's not such a stupid idea. So instead of transporting lots of trees around to lots of various markers that had to mark this, we kind of thought about the video assessment. It was kind of new, so we had to go and make sure we did all the right things through legal and getting permission to video animals and the rest of it, but we managed to work through that process. And then since then I've become a big advocate, which has been Michelle is included in her assessment task, so does Bruce, and actually some others that also have done that. And the main reason was because I had mainly positive comments and amazingly good videos that we ended up having a look at, and we could use them as a discussion tool. And the point is, I have mainly got positive comments. I took unofficial feedback from the students at the end of it, and the students also said they had positive interactions with the during the work placements. And what are we meant to do with assessing workplace learning? I mean, or work integrated learning. I think I still struggle with that, and hopefully videos or podcasts will be part of that. But we want to enhance hermeneutic learning. So what is the interpretation between the clinician, the workplace people, and the student? And to encourage agentic heuristic learning. So they're not afraid to go and have some trial and error in order to learn whilst they're on workplaces. And really importantly, that it's authentic, that comes through in just about every publication. And we need to make sure that it meets professional accreditation requirements for obvious reasons. I went to try and do some, I didn't initially, I thought I just was the process of just do it, be like Nike. And then I tried to go subsequent to that to find some kind of scholarship for learning and teaching to justify what I'd already done, which I should really have done before I did it. But there we go, that's another story. But it seems to be that when working on retrieval tasks, as stated in one of these articles, students benefited the most when they were actually participating themselves. And during the videos, they actually have to participate. I think the discussion might move on a little bit more subsequently, but certainly at this time, they had to go and look for it themselves. And the aim was to try and make it as open as possible, to give them freedom to do whatever they wanted to, within the constraints that they put on themselves or the workplace put on them. So with that, I think I will leave it to Michelle first, and then Bruce to discuss what they've thought, and then hopefully we'll have a nice discussion on what people think, whether videos or podcasts are valid work integrated learning assessment tasks. And now I need to try and stop sharing. Unless
no, that's fine. Leave it up there, Alan. That's completely fine.
Okay.
One of the things I love about videos and podcasts is the contemporary nature of them. Our students, they all carry one of these phone things, like a camera in their pockets, and they really like to document their adventures when they're out in the workplace. So using that for good rather than evil is something that I've tried to capture and that I really like about video assessments and podcasts. We know that our students love looking at things like TikTok and making Facebook reels, and turning their assessment into something that can utilise their creative side as well as the scientific side of their minds just helps refresh them and brings a little bit of creativity and something a bit different into their assessments. Communication is a really big part of our profession, and we have specific communication tasks where they're talking to other professionals and to each other. It's also really good to get them used to communicating in another form, whether or not that's in front of a screen and using slides, etc., as we are now as a prop, or whether that's, as Bruce will talk about in a second, in a podcast where they have to be really engaging to be able to get their message across. So we scaffold this, as Alan said. His early videos start off in the preclinical years in second year, and this is a 6-year degree. My assessment was also a second-year subject, so we scaffold from that and doing a video which they can edit into presentations in later years. So in third and fourth year, students are presenting in front of their peers and others. So we try to scaffold all the way through the course and get them used to doing something that they can heavily edit before they have to talk in front of people. I think that's about all I really wanted to add to this. I'll throw over to Bruce now.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm definitely the third person in this group because I coordinate in a subject in the final year of vet science, and I was struggling with the assignment that the students were needing to submit. And I rang Alan, who happened to be sitting next to Michelle in a car driving around Victoria, and they both said, "Why don't you do a podcast?" So fortunately, I took on their advice. And the couple of things that I've noticed with the final year students is there has been real engagement with this assignment, much more so than previously when they were submitting written. Just one example is this is a one-off podcast that they do, but listening to them, you would think it was part of a series. They really get involved and they create a name for it and they have a lot of fun with it. The second thing is that our students on final year rotation do a lot of travel. So they would spend hundreds of hours in the car during the year going from point A to point B because of where their rotations are. By having it on podcast, the students are able to share their podcasts that they do with other people in their year. So it makes it much more dynamic for them to be able to share it, and we facilitate that sharing on the on Brightspace. And another thing that I've definitely noticed is that the quality of them is sufficient that they can also use them for their CV. And vets that they're going to be applying for jobs are also in the car a lot. And so they can send this podcast and the vet can actually be listening to this podcast on the way around saying, okay, this is the skill set of the student, how they investigate disease, how they approach it and their communication skills. So I think that's a really positive thing. Of course, they could do all these things with a written report, but it's unlikely to be taken up by people who are in the car a lot. And the final thing is I'm in the car a lot. I live 125 k's from Wagga, and I can actually listen to the podcasts as I'm going to or from work and then tell Siri what I think about it to record what the mark is for it. So it's made it much more efficient for me. So at this point, I think it's been a really good move, and I'm happy for people to make comments, particularly criticisms, and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, Alan, and Michelle. I think that's a really good introduction. Can you leave the slide up, please, Alan? Please, can you leave the slide up?
I can do that, but I can't see anything else then.
So
I can't see any other Zoom stuff.
right. Okay. I
So,
will see
do you
that if
want-
I can get up. It's just so that we can have the questions up that you've got there. So
Sure.
that's
So
all.
I get that, but I struggle. I don't see anything else. So I feel a bit at sea.
Okay. Well, then stop sharing and that will be fine, and we can use the questions.
Unless Lachlan can help me there.
No, it's all good. So I'm going to hand it over to everyone that is here to ask Alan and Bruce and Michelle questions and discuss some of their ideas around whether they feel that videos or podcasts are valid assessment tasks when we're looking at work integrated learning, and what other people might think of how we look at ensuring efficiency and marking equity of digital assessments. I know Bruce has obviously improved his marking efficiency by able to mark as he is driving to and from Wagga, listening to the podcasts. And also just see what other people think in different areas of the university where we have work integrated learning, what they think of these kinds of assessment tasks. So I'm going to hand it over to everyone that's here. If you would like to speak, please come off camera. Please turn your camera on and put up your hand as well so that we can see who you are.
I have just shared the slide and the questions for everyone, so that's on my screen. Everyone should be able to see those now.
I have an initial question, if you don't mind, Steph, if I can just ask for a point of clarification.
Go for it, Lachlan.
The term podcast used here, are we talking about an audio recording that the students have made and sent to you, or are we talking about something that's been put onto a streaming platform like Spotify?
That's a great question. It's usually submitted as an MP4 file, so it's a sound file. Some of them submit it through a PowerPoint link as a.
Bruce, we've lost your sound.
I originally asked for video or podcast, but I found the podcast was what I was listening to, and what they have to do for it, just standing in front of it, it's not about the video. So we've moved to completely podcast, and it is as an MP4 file mostly.
Got it. Thank you.
And that's easy to submit on Brightspace. and it's then easy to listen to as well. And access, the other students can all access that quite easily, and it's easy for them to do it on their phones, which is really important when they're driving around.
Thanks, Bruce. Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, team, for that great presentation. And I love how it's scaffolded from, go to woe throughout the cohort. I guess it's a comment more than a question. Well, maybe it is a question. I'll just ask it. Thinking just about feedback. So we know that part of the most important learning that comes from assessment tasks is the feedback that the students get. So I know that feedback happens with the early stage videos, because I sometimes sit into those sessions when they're actually being played and talked about in front of the student cohort. Bruce, what sort of feedback do you provide to the students around the files that they've submitted?
Yes, so can you hear me now? I've just replugged in.
Yeah.
Yep. So I have a rubric in Brightspace, and I fill in the rubric. So I give them information around how engaging their communication was. But most of the feedback I give is on their technical aspects as final year veterinary students, as to they might have done something on pink eye, and then I might mention that perhaps they should look at this reference or that reference. So it's much more, most of the feedback they get is on a technical nature, not so much on the podcast. So it doesn't really change the feedback that they're getting, although I do usually comment. If I've enjoyed it, I say great, really engaging or something, which is very easy to comment on. But I don't do a critique of how they've presented or anything, but I do of their of what they've done from a technical point of view. So that doesn't really add anything from a feedback point of view, possibly.
And sorry, Bruce, just adding on to that, do you have any grasp on how many students actually read the feedback or take the feedback?
Well, I don't have any specific stats. Every in Brightspace, it tells you when you've published it and when the student has opened that they've read it. Every student has read the feedback. I did have a rotation with 9 of the students, and some of them said, we really enjoyed the podcast and thanks for your feedback. So I presume they are looking for it. It's the only assessment that they get their feedback from their 2 assessment items for that subject at the same time, and it's the only time they really find out what's going on. So I presume that there's reasonable interaction there. And my feedback is very specific on a technical issue, so they're probably wanting to know, whether I thought they were on the money or not technically.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in, Steph?
The only downside. Sorry, I was just going to say the only downside is that still a couple of them have just written out what they're going to do and then just read it out, and that's going to happen with some of the students, but most of them are really engaging.
Yeah, just on the scaffolding, I have to say one of the benefits of this is we didn't actually deliberately scaffold this. And I think it's probably a really important aspect of this. Maybe we shouldn't be saying it, but it's what happens with informal discussion and corridor talk, which I think probably just is worthwhile adding in here, that we ended up just having discussions and then ended up doing what you might call, or even we might call, because we're going to give ourselves a pat on the back here, good andragogy. But it kind of happened by mistake, and I think that needs to be remembered.
I think it's important to acknowledge the corridor conversations that staff have about different teaching ideas and doing those sorts of things. So, because that's often where you do have those sort of, oh, I could do that kind of moment. Michael, you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting to think about how to generalize this. So I guess there's the for the people doing the videos, they're recording themselves, which is fine, but they're also recording the people they're working with and the animals. Like, I guess in other contexts, other workplace learning, you'd have patients or customers or whatever, depends on the context, or students that you're dealing with. Like what you said, you did some legal just check with legal about the recording of animals, etc. So what sort of things did you have to do in your context? And I guess the question is, how might that generalize to other circumstances?
I'll take that to start. Anyone can add. Yeah, very interesting. Worried about, always concerned about the third party aspects, and I think that's really important. It somehow doesn't seem to be a problem. We did take it to legal and we did get whatever tool. We have to have a video consent form. It's a lot easier on a farm, which is what we're dealing with, because it's basically the farmer, the farm workers, and the farmers, the animals on that farm. So it's a lot easier than it would be if you were doing, you probably couldn't do this with policing or pharmacy, or when you've got people that you don't have specific permission for. But we did try and make it that some people didn't have any animals in, some people have themselves, some people actually got people they interviewed people and spoke about what was happening on the farm. So there's a whole broad aspect of it, which we deliberately made. I deliberately didn't make it, you have to do this or you don't have to do that, because I wanted to see what they could do, because as soon as you put a restriction on it, then you take away their creativity. And for those people that have seen it, the creativity is it just blows me away every single time, and we've been doing it for about 4 years now.
I think also just with that, Michael, our students in particular, it is driven home to them a number of times right from the get-go in first year about confidentiality and not sharing material online and all of those sorts of things, because it can be taken out of context and that kind of stuff. So that professional behaviour is really drilled into the students from first year as well, and that links into these assessment tasks and things like that. Harriet.
Thank you. I just wondered, and maybe not specifically in your faculty, in your school, but I do wonder, where English is a second language, has there been any barriers for the podcasting or fears around those students who maybe have less confidence, or do you find because it is an oral recording where they're not on screen, there's maybe perhaps less resistance to that versus perhaps a video?
That's a really good question to consider. I will say, before Bruce or Alan or Michelle jump in, within this particular cohort within veterinary science, it is we don't have very many international students. We don't actually have very many students who have English as a second language. Having said that, we do have a lot of students who might struggle in terms of doing oral presentations in front of audiences and those sorts of things. So to give you a context of the student population that we tend to have. Bruce or Alan or Michelle, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. That's a great point. I guess the really interesting thing is that we're actually struggling in this day and age to have competency in students writing, and we're not having as much competency in students talking. And the students are they certainly by final year vet, they are just have listened to so many podcasts, they're right across this sort of thing. So it's possibly easier for them. And in another way, they're not really being assessed just as we don't really assess the students at this stage on their writing, even though it annoys us. We don't really assess them on their podcast delivery, although I comment on it, as much as their technical assessment of what they're presenting. So that's possibly not, it's a useful thing because they like podcasts. It helps their communications, but none of those are part of the assessment. So it's not a real barrier for them. If they're not overly confident, they're not going to fail a subject based on their lack of confidence or even their English capability. And yeah, sorry, that's enough.
I'm just having a quick look in the chat as well. And Nicole has made the comment about we need to consider the student use of AI too to script their podcast. So that's something that I think we probably need to look at, Alan and Bruce and Michelle.
Absolutely. And after the presentations the other day, I mean, we're stuck. I mean, whether it's written or whether it's podcast doesn't make any difference for AI. We've got the same challenge. So I don't think the format makes any difference. I think the challenge is enormous.
Yeah.
I guess the challenge, what we're going to do for is, though, we don't have to get every single assessment AI proof, right? Like the videos are much harder to, to completely simulate. It actually requires other people. So like, it's the making sure that across your degree, you've got enough things in place, which you must because of all the practical components. But you don't. I think you can. You just have to think about it from a whole course perspective rather than individual assessments.
Yeah.
Like you don't want to start penalizing students who are trying to do the right thing on a few months. Like if it's actually a good task for people generally trying to learn, go for it. If there's a few people who are trying to cheat, make sure they get they get caught at somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Michael. And yeah, and I think this is great. I love the idea of having the podcast as like a formative or assessment or low stakes assessment, perhaps even. And I really love the way it was justified of why they're using them with the whole context of let's have assessment tasks or get students to do tasks they can actually fit in with listening to podcasts and driving. I think that's fantastic. And I think of great benefit to the student, and also it's so easily shareable so they can learn from each other as well. So I think it's a great approach. I just wanted to put the AI in thing just because, yeah, if we need that assurance of learning, we will need to build that in, like you said, and use a programmatic approach. So yeah, well done, team. It looks really interesting. And I'd love the subject code so I can have a look at how you've set up those tasks too, if that's okay. Be cheeky and ask for those.
Bruce and Alan and Michelle, can you put the relevant subject codes, please, into the chat? That would be great. Harriet, you've got another question or comment?
It was more of a comment around the AI writing script. I suppose at the moment, it's more technically advanced to have AI read the script. So maybe perhaps at the moment there's an argument for, although AI has written it, at least they're orally presenting it. So you would think there is some learning happening in the delivery at least.
Yeah.
So that may just be, who knows where it's going and how quickly and easily that will be overcome. But I do think at the present time, there is argument that there is some sort of learning happening, even if they are just reading the script.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I was going to say the same, but I did notice that these days you can actually produce something without even needing to read it, and it sounds as though you've read it according to all the videos. So we might be missing that. But my view is that even going to the effort to set all up for AI, they've had to learn something. So we've got to take a little bit of that. But it's still the same thing. If we got a written assignment, they could just hand it in. You really don't know. I do put the script of the video, and if they don't provide the podcast, if they don't provide the script, it's easy to translate the script in the podcast into script. All our things do that automatically through Turnitin, just to keep an eye on it. But that's not going to match it with AI anyway these days.
And I'm just going to jump in there before Steph kicks us all off and keeps us to time. We are a little bit lucky that our students are generally, on the whole, very highly motivated to learn. They're learning for a reason, and particularly in final year where Bruce's students are undertaking this the podcast assessment, the rubber's really hitting the road. They're out in practice for the entire year and they're about to graduate. So they are highly motivated to learn, and it's in their best interest to actually learn the material and prepare the material themselves. So we are lucky.
And the very last question in the last minute is Alan would love to know if anyone will now consider this as an assessment option in their subject or in their course. So is there anyone here who would now consider using podcasts or videos for workplace or work integrated learning assessment?
Should have had a poll set up for that, Alan.
So there's a few. Okay. Excellent. So rightio. Well, thank you very much, Michelle, Bruce, and Alan. I think it is a very interesting way of looking at assessment. And I also think there's a number of things that we can look at in terms of how Gen AI and that kind of stuff can also be used as part of that. Hopefully I'm now sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen? Yep.
Yep.
Our second roundtable for this morning is another one of my School of Agricultural, Environmental and Veterinary Science colleagues, Jennifer Manyweathers, who has got a presentation around what do summative marks do for our students' learning and what happens if we do things differently. So Jennifer, over to you.
Sorry, I just mad scramble when you lose the unmute button when you change your screen. Sorry about that. Well, thank you. Thanks for being part of this discussion. It's really such a good thing to just sit and think about what it is that we do. We hardly ever get a chance to do it when we think about teaching. And so I'm really glad to be part of this this couple of days, and also this working group in particular. So this is completely blue sky thinking for me. This is not something that I'm doing. It's something that I want to do, and I'd just be really interested in hearing from as many people as possible around your thoughts around this. But basically, what I've been thinking about is what happens if we just stop at giving marks to students' learning. What happens with that? So that's kind of the premise for the discussion today. I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you this morning from Yuin country on the coast, the Yuin Nation. I feel very lucky to be there. That photo is one of my favourite places where you actually sit above the sea eagles, a very special place indeed. And I just want to acknowledge any of our Indigenous elders who are in the room at the moment and thank them for their ongoing and committed care for country wherever we're coming from. Just quickly today, I just thought I'd chuck in some I guess some jargon that I think about, just so that you know where I'm coming from. Your definitions might be slightly different around some of the teaching words that we use. Caveats, you know, I'm a vet. I'm not anything else except a vet. So this is kind of very much blue sky thinking for me. And I guess I want to spend most of the time just chucking stuff around and talking about stuff. So I'll go through quickly the little bit that I know about this, well, they call it the ungrading movement, which is underway. Why is it a good time to think about it? Just massive challenges that we're all facing as educators. I don't know how many, well, if I had $1 for every time a student said to me, I'm paying for this course, I'm not getting my money's worth, I could probably retire. Am I right? I think I'm right. We're seeing also ongoing attrition in a lot of our courses. Vets and teaching is another one where we put huge amounts of resources and effort into producing these graduates, and for whatever reason we don't see the flow through in the profession for longevity in the profession. Massive challenges that we've already alluded to about AI and technology and managing academic integrity and being really sure that our students know what we want them to know. I guess that's where the technology becomes challenging. And, these teaching efficiency approaches that we're undergoing at the moment, where the universities run along those business lines where there's just no way, teaching is a relational job and it's never going to be completely efficient for that reason. So these are just some of the challenges. So just with the jargon, so when I talk about summative assessment, what I mean is it's usually the process that happens at the end of a subject. We're wrapping it up, we're summing up what's there, and we usually give a mark for it. So most of us do sort of an end of subject final exam. I do some interactive orals, but there's still that summative assessment at the end of the learning. The thing to think about with that is that there's no opportunity to change anything. So you can't change how you're teaching that cohort. You can't intervene for a student. It's the end point, and that's what we're marking. So we call that sort of assessment of learning. That's as close as we get to knowing what the students might know at that point in time. That's just a snapshot in time. The other type of assessment that we talk about is formative assessment. So that's as learning is forming as we're going along, and that happens throughout the teaching and learning process. And that's the time at which we can actually change what we're doing if it's not working, or change it for the whole cohort, or change it for an individual student if we find that for whatever reason our words, our prac, our whatever is just not working for them. we have time to change it. So that's formative assessment. And I would count that as assessment for learning, because learning can still happen throughout that assessment process. There's still an opportunity for learning, as opposed to the summative assessments. There's no learning that happens. The students come in, they do an exam, they walk out the door, and they haven't actually learned anything, because they never actually know what they get right or wrong, usually with most of our exams. Another type of doing assessment is assessment as learning. I'm not going to mention that today, but that's another way of encouraging students to think about how they think. So it's this higher sort of metacognition about their own learning. But we won't, as I said, we won't get into that today. So what do we know about grading? So there's research is just really starting. I tried to find something about from the point of view of employers, and I couldn't actually find too much there yet. It might be that it's a bit too early in the process to really have a grasp on whether this actually makes a difference to employers and how they find graduates who've gone through this ungrading process. Basically, ungrading is the process where you focus on feedback and evaluation of the work. You don't actually give it a mark. So it's you can pass, you can move on to the next phase of the learning once you've shown competency. So you don't get a mark per se. What it does for motivation, so grading itself, it's like those sticky notes that students get on their work. That's extrinsic motivation. It's not the best way forward. So intrinsic motivation is something that we carry within us, and we're all really different, but that's something that is completely transferable to other situations. Extrinsic motivation is the dog that only sits when you've got food in your hand, as opposed to the dog that can learn to sit on given prompts, knowing that sometimes they'll get food and sometimes they won't, but it's not based on the food alone. So intrinsic motivation is the strong driver. It's the transferable driver for learning. Grading increases that dependency on, well, I'm just going to learn this to get the marks. I'm not going to learn it to have active, useful knowledge. Research has shown that, and we see this in all our students, grading, increases anxiety. It can increase avoidance behaviour. But it's interesting too that for some students, and I'm sure you can imagine, some of the students in your own cohorts, ungrading also causes anxiety, partly because it's very new and they're not sure that you're going to know enough about them to give them appropriate feedback. The last two comments on that slide are titles taken from papers, and they just really resounded with me, because that's what I want for my students. I want them for them to think it's okay to make mistakes. If we produce students, and I'll speak from the vet cohort, but it's probably true across the board. If we produce students that haven't learnt how to fail, how to bear that burden, learn from that mistake, and then go on ready to make another mistake, just not that same mistake again, then we've really let them down. We haven't prepared them for that profession, that veterinary profession. And this idea of success is learning. Success is not getting a distinction or a credit. So they really resounded with me, as in, that's the kind of learning environment that I want to create for my students. This came from one of my colleagues who was just trying to think outside the box about what we do and how we do it at university. So the current situation is where, we give assessment marks, and then when they get enough marks, they get the subject, they've passed the subject, they do enough subjects, they have the course. That's the structure that most universities run on at the moment. But what might be possible is we have the qualification. So I'll use VET as an example again, and we collect evidence throughout their time with us that they're developing those skills. So it's more like a checklist based on feedback and evaluation, just ongoing throughout the course. Can they put in a catheter? No, not yet. Okay, well, let's circle back around and keep working on that until they get to the stage where they can competently put in a catheter, say in a healthy animal, an animal that's come in for a spay, and then we scaffold that onto an animal that has, heart issues. So it just gets harder and harder and harder. Can they do that? maybe that's not a graduate outcome. Maybe we don't need them to be able to do that when they graduate, but we can certainly scaffold towards those skills. And it's not a mark based, it's a can they do it repeatedly? Yes. So then we can move on to the next skill. And then they come out with this portfolio of skills and self-confidence that they can actually do the work that will be asked of them. So these are the questions that I had in the abstract, and they're a little bit sideways again against what I'm thinking about, but like a lot of the evidence in education research points to the power of feedback. That's students learn from feedback. And I know, and I've had it myself, where you put loads of effort into the feedback and the students don't even read it. You can see it on Turn It In or whatever. They haven't even opened it. All they care about is the mark. And you can see that that's built into the system. So all we've shown them we care about is the mark. So that why would they care about anything else? And the fact that we're giving them feedback when it's too late for them to do anything with that feedback. We give it as summative feedback, if we give it at all. Why would you read it? I wouldn't read it. In fact, I haven't read it as a mature ed student. I haven't read it because it's not going to impact, it's not going to change what I do. So thinking really, really widely about, well, what feedback do we give? And is it feedback? Is it formative feedback? So are we contributing to the learning process as opposed to giving summative feedback at the end when it's too late for anything to change? Thinking too just about the processes that we have in place. So wanting our students to have the confidence in the skills and the knowledge that they're developing themselves. Our students have really poor capacity to judge their own quality of their work. They either think they did really well and they get completely shocked when they get an AE or they fail, or the other way around, they've done really well. They either want to do better or they just don't have any sense of, well, where does my work fit into the world, the veterinary world? And I think that's a really hard place to be as a learner, because it's kind of like you didn't get the memo about what's expected. And so that doesn't encourage sort of students to make mistakes, to take risks, and that's the best place for them to be in, to be in the best place to learn, I guess. That's all I wanted to say. As you can see, it's very blue sky, and so I don't have any particular direction that I want the conversation to go in, but I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts around anything I've said or anything that you've been thinking.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think your presentation ties in really nicely with the presentation that was delivered last week in relation to programmatic assessment and the move towards programmatic assessment and changes in assessment strategies across the university sector as well. There's quite a few comments in the chat that Bruce and Helen and Michelle and Alan have all made comments about it. Bruce has written that this is great, but doesn't it still end up that to move on, they have to reach a stage of learning, and if they don't, they fail as our subjects do not run continuously. And that he certainly agrees that it's very frustrating when assessing students to not be able to fix their mistakes when it is a final assessment. And then Helen has made a comment, does extrinsic potentially add to students cheating or using AI to assist them in their assessments? I think we need to look at the fact that if you look at, say, for instance, Sydney Uni, it's in Sydney Morning Herald today that they are now allowing Gen AI across the board as part of their assessment processes. Thanks for putting the link in, Lachlan. So yeah, they've made a radical reversal of their cheating policy, and they have 2 lanes for their assessment, lane 1 and lane 2. And those that are basically essentially cannot use Gen AI, and then everything else where you can use Gen AI. And I think that also feeds into this discussion as well, in terms of how students attempt assessments, but also how we could potentially use Gen AI as helping to provide feedback as well to students. Michelle's made a really good point in relation to the fact that feedback is great when it's timely, and so often it isn't. So students don't actually give the attention it needs. And I think there is also, we have a lot of students who, as you said, and rightly identified, that they basically all they want is the mark they don't necessarily see the value in the feedback, and they don't learn from that feedback. So, and then Alan perhaps has a solution to that with the fact that he's heard that some educators supply feedback first, and then some at a later stage mark to try and encourage that use of feedback. So I think there's lots of interesting comments there, and it would be really good to hear from other people here as well about what their thoughts are around changing the way we're assessing our students. Michael.
I'm gonna unmute myself. I've got lots of thoughts on this. Like, it's the you think about what happens in school. So at university, students are very much trained to, if it's value, if it's got marks, it's important. If it's not worth marks, it's not important, I think, for some of them. So we have to give marks for it to add importance. Where at school, that's not the case. Certainly, as you go early on in the process, for a high school teacher, even lower level high school, it's, they do homework. They would get feedback on their homework if it's a good situation, just like I think someone was referring to. So, like, I know some of my high school teacher friends, they were in maths, so very much very quantitative judgment of things. They would just give feedback. So this, you got it right. This is, you need to improve. Doesn't say how much. Doesn't give a total mark or anything like that. It's just about the feedback, which is exactly what you're referring to, right? So high school does finish with a big summative task, as we know, but they, at least because of students coming all the way through, that's sort of what they're fixed. So some of this process has to require reteaching students how we do things is part of it. So I think it's good to try to do that. How do you do that in a manageable way? The other thing I can see is a lesson we got from engineering. So engineering, they try to make a radically new, different types of degree when they started it a bunch of years ago. Some of their sets of subjects were called topic tree subjects, which is basically a whole bunch of mini tasks, so 3-hour work essentially at a time. And the idea is students had to show competency in it. Now, they weren't individually marked, but it was just say, it's whether competency is the wrong word, if they mastered it or not. So mastering was the phrase they used, which is appropriate, right? So just if you can design a concrete slab or something like that, I think those things they had. It didn't work so well for a few reasons. One, it gave way too much agency to the students, and so they'd lost a rhythm to the subject. And so often didn't do things for quite some time until they realised, there's a deadline looming, and they had hours and hours of work to do. And so we need to make sure that we don't lose the rhythm of our subjects, like that regular turning up to class or doing work that we've got is actually really helpful for people structuring their learning. Giving flexibility within that's important. And the other thing is, they also had a 3-year version of this, so a subject that lasts for 3 years where they did all of them. And the lack of a really strong deadline to the very, very end also proved that very difficult for students. And so having that subject, so not losing sense of subjects, because students also want to get credit, right? So if they come in from another university or leave for various circumstances, they need to be able to say, I've got this volume of learning already. So some sort of sense of credit's important. So we need to make sure we don't lose sight of subjects. I'm all for this programmatic idea of assessment is, at the end, though, students trying to get a course. So how do we keep that balance is going to be tricky. But yeah, I mean, I agree with your sentiment. So how do we make sure that students see feedback as the important bit? Like you learn through making mistakes. It's really, really important. I think that just should be considered as that's it. That's normal. So if we don't get that message across, we're not doing a good job ourselves. So.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think we kid ourselves, and I know that I do, if we think that having a summative a task with a mark on it equals learning, because it doesn't. All that means is they've captured enough of the information get them over the line. And anecdotally, they'll tell you that they do the test, they walk out, they forget everything, they move on to the next thing. And we see it in our students because, you know, in the courses that are scaffolding, you have to teach it again, and then you teach it again the next year, and then you teach it again the next year. Yeah, so I guess that's yeah. I loved hearing about that engineering, because there's lots of ways that could have been done slightly differently to actually make that a really meaningful process. Some of the stuff that's going into the chat too is about the extra workload that may be associated with formative tasks. It would take, you know, it would take us a complete and utter turn on their heads. I'm not saying it's impossible. It would be hugely challenging to remove summative tasks, but also they take a lot of time. And so if we had the opportunity to say, well, no, actually, you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to design a summative task at the end. You don't have to mark it. Have back those hours. What are you going to do to show your, you know, to convince yourself and convince the students that they know what they're talking about? That would be amazing, but not trying to fit it in with what we've already got and teaching efficiency. Don't make me say it again. Yeah, hugely challenging, intriguing, but very challenging.
Yeah. So Bruce, you've got a question or a comment?
Yeah, I mean, just listening to Michael there after what Jennifer had said, I can see, and I'm involved in the vet course, so I'm being very vet director, I'm sorry, but I can see in the vet course it would work really well to only have some sort of final assessment and not have any between years 1 and 6. I think that would be really good. I mean, what we'd be concentrating on, and this is what we need the students to do in a vet degree, is get their day one competencies. And our feedback in each of the sessions would be to each of the students, this is where you've got to be at, this is what you've got to do. It would take the real stress out of it. Yeah. You would still get attrition, because people would realise, as they always do halfway through a 6-year degree, that's not for them. So you'd need some sort of exit strategy, because the problem is you haven't yet said they've reached any degree until the end. But in the end, the students take on the stress of that final, and what Michael was referring to, I was reflecting on the HSC, and, you know, year 11 for kids is a really nice year because they get to do subjects they've chosen to do, and there's no real stress in it. And by the time they get to year 12, they've sort of been convinced that most of the stress has been taken out of it because they've done the hard work. So it's still stressful, but it's not as bad as it used to be when it sort of was all just, you know, 1 year and you had to do it. So I can see that, and I can see that from a staff perspective, as you say, handing back those really depressing teaching marking hours. And I think my worst 8 hours this year, and probably in the last 10 years, was when I had to mark a PBL assignment, where I thought I'd done a really good job, and I couldn't give the feedback back to the students. In fact, I went back to a group of students and gave the feedback. I just got the wrong students. So when I was ranting and raving, they were wondering why I was talking to them. And they did point out they weren't the ones that did the exam. It was another year. So I let them go and then went and rant and raved to the other year. But I think it's really important. You know, they all pass, so they think they're right, but they're not necessarily where they need to be. But we're not going to fail 100% of students. So, yeah, I think there's a...
Yeah. Alan.
Yeah, thanks. I like the blue sky thinking when you chuck stuff around, Jennifer. I couldn't resist that one. But how bad would it be then? Because we all know that what is taught isn't necessarily learned. And if we're having to teach it again when they have shown us that they may have actually learned it, how are we going to know that they've actually learned anything when we haven't really assessed them to see if it's learned? Or is that the point?
So I'm not saying not assessing, I'm just saying change what we call assessment. So it's ongoing assessments, ongoing formative conversations, feedback. So in a classroom, like as in primary school or high school classrooms, the assessment process is going along all the time. So you have a conversation, just anecdotal conversations with students when they're working through problems. Oh, I can see that, yeah, they're really not getting that. Okay, we can circle back around, and that forms that formative assessment task. So it doesn't even need to be something that's in the subject outline per se. It's that ongoing checking. So, you know, when I teach epi, so every time I come across them and I can say, oh, that sounds like a disease outbreak, what are we going to do with that? What, you know, talk to me about odds ratio. What are you going to set up to measure an odds ratio to see which animals are at risk here? And that's ongoing through 3rd year, 4th year, 5th year. And then by the time we get to 6th year, it should be that they don't even need me to say this looks like a disease outbreak investigation. They're like, oh, I can see that more than, you know, we have 5 animals here, we're going to start doing these processes. And so then because I haven't had to prompt for it, then I can see that those skills are developing organically there. I'm not sure whether I've addressed your concerns or questions, Alan.
No, I guess we just don't know, and it's a conversation. Also, Julie's put some really interesting stuff in the chat as well. Yeah.
Because I think Michael, I think you mentioned about we have to have subjects, because I would actually disagree. I think silo teaching, and I can only again speak for vet, but silo teaching is really risky because vets we don't work in silos. We work with living, breathing animals that have all the systems in one. And so I think, you know, I'd really like the chance to teach outside of those silos, even though it would be terrifying, because then how do we, you know, having subjects at least gives us something to hang on to in this sea of chaos sometimes. But I think that it's very risky to teach in silos. And I think Julie's probably captured that, is that, we need to be teaching physiology and anatomy as if it's one thing, because it kind of is. Sorry.
So just on that very quickly, Nicole, before I get to you, just on that, Jennifer, when the vet program first started back in 2005, 2006, anatomy, physiology, developmental biology was all taught with one common theme across that particular delivery. So, for instance, when you were doing anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract, you were also doing gastrointestinal tract physiology, but the overriding theme was the fact that you had a calf with neonatal scours. So it then was linking it all together, and over time that kind of, with changes in subjects and changes in staff and all of that kind of stuff, that kind of sort of programmatic approach in terms of making sure that there was alignment across subjects and things like that has actually changed and moved away. And so there was that kind of sort of approach of going, well, you need to understand the physiology and understand fluid balance and that kind of stuff, but at the same time you were also doing the anatomy and everything like that. So I think that is something that needs to potentially be looked at again, because it does help.
We are, as part of our course review, that is exactly what.
And I was just about to say that, Michelle.
I know Michael's got his hand up, but
Yep.
I just have to say that was spoken by the person who wore a skeleton as tights while she was teaching things on the skeletal system in physiology. So it's definitely well past silo and programmatical.
Thank you, Bruce. I no longer have those tights. Nicole, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Just some points I wanted to add in here. So I'm an educational designer, but I've also been teaching as a sessional. I was teaching as a sessional for the School of Business. So just a couple of things. I really appreciate that notion of, I don't like the whole thing about silo teaching. And I guess working in course design and course review over the years, the logistics of developing and producing and marketing and delivering courses with often many degrees are just sort of a whole range of subjects across different schools bolted together. So I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. Students they seem to compartmentalize each of their subjects as separate things, as you mentioned. And of course, in teaching business, it's, 1 minute you're doing accounting, then it's law. It's a lot of different things. So thanks, Lachlan. I'll talk quickly. So I think that's definitely a course review while we're in course review and considering that student experience. And yes, when you are a professional, you are not just doing things separately. Feedback from my own experience, what I found students were quite receptive was, I would, before an assessment was due, I'd say, look, here's a summary of the key feedback I gave last year to a very similar assessment task. I'm giving this to you now, so please take that on board. And their ears would prick up. Oh, okay, so, and I did find, you know, that the assessments still, just not everyone took that on board, but a lot of students did, and those students did very much better because they didn't make the same mistake. So that was useful. Personally, I'm quite motivated by marks, I have to admit, and I like to know to have that quantification of how well I'm doing and where my shortcomings are. So I think that extrinsic motivation for some students may still be a driver as well. And yeah, and definitely we need to make sure that we do be mindful of the feedback we give and how we give feedback. When you're giving feedback on the 60th assessment task that you've marked over the last week, sometimes your tone can be less friendly when you are, you know, when people keep still making the same mistake. So yeah, that professional development in that would be important. And I'll be quiet now.
Bruce, have you got something very quickly to add? Given that we're now a minute over time and we need to have a 15-minute break, and everybody also needs to complete the survey. Very quickly, Bruce.
No, I didn't lower my hand.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your participation in the session today. I think it's been a really interesting roundtable discussion. Thank you to Alan, Jennifer, Michelle, Bruce for your presentations. I would really appreciate it if everyone could complete the feedback on this session via the CSEdX feedback form. There is a QR code there as well, and I actually don't have the link to post in the chat, sorry. But anyway, it would be really useful to have that feedback. I'm going to close this session, and I hope that everyone can join the rest of Harriet's actually put in the feedback form as well. Thank you, Harriet. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for coming along this morning.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Lachlan.
Steph.
Thank you. Bye.